at 6:30. The dinner will be almost next door at the very end of the Salzburg Library. We'll have that set up, and so we'll retire over there. And after the dinner, roughly after the dinner, when everybody has had their wine and other drinks to help spirits flow, we'll have open floor testimonial. Tom Thorpe, welcome back. Tom will help guide us through that. Right now we're getting in the second session that's entitled On Common Ground. And our Adam Blair, who just received his PhD somewhat recently,
yeah, 2 years ago,
will moderate. And if you see him jumping up and down a little bit, he also has his camera, so he's taking spontaneous photos as well. Okay. So Adam, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Hello everybody. We're going to have this session be very similar to the last session. Everyone will speak for about 15 minutes, and Ed can do a little talk back after that, and then has some remarks planned for the end. So this session is entitled On Common Ground, and we will hear from Professor Megan Craig of Stony Brook University.
So I want to thank Anne for bringing one of Ed's paintings into the room, which I hadn't anticipated, but that's going to be really helpful and perfect. So as the theme of this panel is common ground, I thought I might say something about painting as it relates to the ground that Ed and I share. As most of you know, both Ed and I are painters, with a crucial difference being that Ed has written often and extensively about paintings and painters, while I have largely kept painting separate from my own philosophical writing. There's a long and illustrious tradition of phenomenology in painting. Paint seems to be the preferred medium for so many phenomenologists, past and present. In addition to Ed, I am thinking of Heidegger and Van Gogh, Merleau-Ponty and Cézanne, Deleuze and Francis Bacon, Jean-Luc Nancy and Caravaggio, among others, and the list could go on. Though Ed has written about too many painters and traditions to count, I think of his work as primarily associated with the abstract expressionism of Willem de Kooning. His chapter on de Kooning in Earth Mapping, Artists Reshaping Landscape, remains one of my favorite philosophical texts to read and to teach. There, Ed gives us the distinction between a top-down, distanced, cartographic form of mapping that yields an overview of a place, and a different, absorptive form of mapping, a close-range bodily groping that gives us what he calls, quote, the scene from the ground. De Kooning becomes the primary exemplar of absorptive mapping in Ed's analysis, a mapping that invites us to a new experience of landscape and of ourselves. Looking back at Earth mapping in preparation for today, I was reminded of two coincidences that link Ed's and my painting lives. The first relates to Ed's invocation of de Kooning's 1960 painting, Door to the River, about which he writes, quote, "The door to the river indicates a pathway into a wild world, which de Kooning's paintings for the next 3 decades will map in their uniquely concrete, body-bound manner," end quote. It was exactly that painting that I saw when I was an undergraduate at Yale University, other ground that Ed and I share, in 1997. I took the train to the city to see a de Kooning retrospective at the Met, just a couple of weeks before de Kooning died. And from that moment on, Door to the River became my favorite painting. I have kept a postcard of it on the wall of every studio I've ever inhabited. It spoke to me about color and energy, humor and pain, but also about thresholds and landscapes and the possibility that the built environment might open onto the inhuman world in some other way, without violence or usurpation. The second coincidence is in Ed's attention to the painter Eve Ingalls, one of 5 contemporary artists Ed considers in part 2 of Earth Mapping. Without knowing who she was, I met Ingalls once in the hallway of an old factory in New Haven where I rented a painting studio for several years. She was clearing out her own studio on the same floor, and I happened upon her at the end of a dark corridor, lugging massive canvases out of her space, slashing them with a razor blade, and leaving them in a heap. I was distraught to see the paintings being carved up and thrown away, and I, ever a scavenger, asked if I might have them. She reluctantly agreed, making me promise to unstretch each one and discard the canvas. She said I could have the stretchers. I gathered 20 or 30 of her paintings that day, each one slashed down the middle. And over the last 13 years or so, I have been diligently unstretching them and throwing them away as she asked, before stretching new canvas across her frames, each one bearing scrawled titles and dates in black Sharpie to make my own work. How odd then to find de Kooning's Door to the River and Eve Ingalls' haunting maps inhabiting Ed's book, while they are there in my studio, one on the wall and the other stacked like a pile of excavated bones. What does it mean to share ground as painters? Ed and I don't share that much geographical ground. Ed from the Midwest and now mostly located on the West Coast. Me from the Northeast and still located here. In painting, ground refers to the substrate of the painting, not the blank canvas, paper, or panel, but whatever the artist has done to prepare the surface for the painting. This might include priming, gluing, or adding layers of paint. Dutch painters in the last part of the 17th century were known to paint on a dark ground. This was apparently a time-saving technique, as it was faster and cheaper to work from dark to light than from light to dark in oil paint. Some speculate it was also a way of acknowledging darkness and death. Duquesne painted on a reddish ground, Rembrandt preferred brown. Art conservators complain that paintings made on a dark ground continue to darken over the ages, leading to an overall lack of light and dingy quality. Despite that, I have followed the practice, not out of any spiritual orientation or quest to mimic the past, but because I can't bear the purity of a white ground, and I love to be able to paint the lightest lights in a picture without competition from the blaring white of an underlying surface. In oil painting, you have to begin by preparing your ground, sealing the surface with rabbit skin glue or gesso or both, painting and sanding and painting again until you've achieved a smooth, eggshell-like surface that has enough tooth for the paint to grip and that will hold for ages. I've always followed those steps with an immediate roughing up of the ground, a turpentine-drenched layer of burnt sienna scrubbed from edge to edge, leaving the surface looking like old wood or dirt. I'm lucky to own a small painting of Ed's, a landscape made on the coast of Maine where he has gone to paint in the summer for I don't know how many years. Ed framed it in black with a dark red matting. His painting, and I think his preferred medium, is watercolor. I can tell that his ground is the white of the raw paper, the gaps between his strokes letting the light of the page glisten from behind. In representing place, he writes, quote, "Any given painting is realized in terms of the surface that is its traga, or bearer. The properties of this surface influence, as from a gravitational ground, the qualities of the pictorial space that appears by its means. The pictorial space, configured as represented place, is not so much superimposed on this ground as allowed to arise from it." End quote. So it is with Ed's painting. The water, rocks, and sky emerge from the texture and tone of the page. Watercolor is a notoriously difficult medium. Unlike oil paint, which in addition to being toxic, can be scraped down and piled on, watercolor registers every mark. You have to build it up slowly, rub it out with a damp cloth, though you'll never erase it once it hits the page. Things pool, seep, and bleed, and the paper itself can absorb or repel the pigment in mysterious ways. Working outside in the sun, the paint might dry entirely in less than a minute. This is so different from the materiality and pace of oil paint, which can remain wet to the touch and gooey in the center for months or even years. Ed's strokes are energetic and dispersed, a sort of explosion or dispersion of grays and greens scattering across the page. I once sat in a meeting in the dean's office at Stony Brook University here, staring directly at a large framed Ed Casey painting. It had the same energy of mark and rhythm, of touch everywhere, that gives Ed's paintings their musical feel. If paintings have speeds, and I think they do, then Ed's are quick, not because they are made in a certain length of time, but because they make you feel speedy, alive, and propelled as your eye refuses to settle into any one spot. Deleuze described the sinkholes in Francis Bacon's paintings, rugs, drains, holes, and circular tar pits that could capture the gaze and get it stuck there. Ed's paintings never do that. Instead, they send the gaze all over. I should say glance. They send the glance all over. More like de Kooning, more like jazz. Both of us, Ed and I, have painted outside in landscapes that we return to. For Ed, this has been mostly at the edge of the sea in Maine. For me, it has been in city streets, on rooftops, and occasionally in sand dunes or in fields facing stone walls. Ed appears to have a more precise approach and a more ritualistic practice. His paintings seem animated by the skittering light on the ocean, his colors borrowed from rocks and sky. It's a bit like Cézanne returning to Mont Saint-Victoire, the ruddy clay of the mountains becoming one with his palette, or Bonnard going back to the interior of a house where a certain orange hue becomes the structuring agent of the picture. The repetition of painting the same scene yields intimacy, but also a secret knowledge about the variability of everything. You go back day after day, like Morandi to his bottles, only to find that nothing is the same, not even the least animate objects, not even the brush or the colors, not even yourself. Reading Ed as a painter is perhaps a way of approaching his unique phenomenological style. Ideally, one would have one of his paintings hanging on the wall to glance up at while reading his text. You could, for instance, read the prelude to The World on Edge, which moves in barely 3 pages from the cliffs of Morro Bay, California, to the Coffee Cafe, to Tahrir Square in Cairo, and look up at Ed's painted strokes to learn something about his form of movement, a boundless all-over sensibility, and a light touch that also structures his writing. There's a radical democracy to this approach, an active resistance to any stark differentiation between center and periphery. Even though Ed's paintings, at least the ones I've seen, are primarily landscapes, they, like his books, also seem joyfully imbued with crowds and noise. He is equally at home in a desolate landscape or in Brooklyn, a rare breed Deleuze and Guattari dubbed, quote, the true nomad. Ed's movement across a page, painted or written, shares something with his own movement in space. One of the curious things about Ed is that he always seems to be moving. I've never known if this is because you can actually feel the whir of his mind, or because so many of my conversations with him seem to take place in transit or in places of transit. Ed wearing a backpack and pulling a black rolling bag full of books behind him. Even when we're sitting still, Ed seems to be in motion, not restless or squirmy, but like his landscapes, scintillating, a word he taught my daughter when she was 5. His texts, too, have a unique speed. Sometimes in reading him, I have to stop to catch my breath. I recall finishing The World at a Glance in preparation for writing a review of the book, and feeling I had just tried to trail a lead runner in a marathon. How had a glance amounted to so much? How did he keep the momentum for that many pages? Ed often describes his own work as periphenomenology. stressing phenomena that resist full appearance or that have been historically overlooked or underrated. He reminds us that, quote, peri signifies going around or about with an element of risk-taking, end quote. Elsewhere, he writes that periphenomenology is, quote, sensitive to the outer parts of things and places, and requires a special form of attentiveness that goes straight to the exoskeletal structure of things and places, end quote. A few pages later, Ed describes his own writing process as, quote, weaving a net of descriptions. I would say that Ed exhibits a painter's sensitivity to his surroundings. He looks with a focus special to someone who has learned to be skeptical of the speed of the mind and knows something about the pace and the thought of the hand. It's a form of attention I also associate with William James, another artist, and with radical empiricism more generally. A risk-taking effort of description that aims to be true to the moving stream of experience without pinning anything down or deadening it by scrutiny. Why paint the landscape? Not to depict a place with precision, but to learn from it, to be in it, to keep it alive, to keep oneself alive. Why write philosophy? Not to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help us God, but to witness and participate in the life of thought, the lives of others, and to feel alive among them. If Ed thinks of periphenomenology as a net, a web, an ectoskeleton, then his own paintings again prove instructive. They are like open armatures of the landscapes they depict, fishing nets cast over the beach or rocks or sky. The logic seems to be openness everywhere, closure nowhere. Hence all the gaps where the paper shines through, their lightness of being, as if each painting refrains Leonard Cohen's lines, there is a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. When I turn from Ed's luminous little watercolor landscape hanging in my studio to my own work, my paintings seem cramped and sticky. Oil paint can have this effect, like mud thrown against a wall. But it's also the dark ground of my own work, all the cracks and gaps, a reddish brown sucking up the light. I'm not sure how Ed works on a white surface. It seems like a miracle every time I think about it. What I hope is that more people look at Ed's paintings as they read his books, and perhaps above all, that in his retirement, Ed finds more time to paint and to toss his luminous nets over the world. Time is not something I've ever known Ed to worry about. In fact, his resistance to time is as miraculous to me as his ability to face a pristinely white canvas and begin from there. Perhaps as an oil painter, I inhabit a different temporality, taking months, years, a lifetime to cure. Ed lives as watercolor, quicksilver. Sometimes I think back to the first time I met him in 2006 when I was a graduate student at the New School, and I can imagine myself as Alice seeing the white rabbit scurry by, desperately trying to follow him and finding myself going down, down, down into another world, the wonderland of Stony Brook University. The white rabbit always just ahead, but out of reach. Except in Alice in Wonderland, the rabbit is clutching his pocket watch, fretting, oh dear, I shall be too late. It's the very opposite of anything I've ever heard Ed say. I'm not sure he owns a watch, or if he does, what he uses it for. The only occasions I've ever seen him attentive to time were in the years when he excused himself to call his sister or to receive one of her calls. Other than that, Ed's refrain has been, we're only just getting started. He would say this at midnight, when most everyone was winding down, or toward the end of a dissertation defense, or after several glasses of wine. We're only just getting started, Megan. As if time has no hold or relation to planetary orbits. As if time is just a windmill we've all mistaken for a dragon. There was a brief interlude right after I gave birth, when Ed and I occupied the same temporal ground. I would be up all night, but especially wake at 3 or 4 a.m. to feed my daughter Cora, and then write from then until 7 or 8 when she needed me again. Invariably, Ed was awake and at work too. It was then that I realized that the web-like diaphanous quality of his writing might have something to do with the hours before daybreak, when things are hushed and indistinct. Those are painter's hours, blue moments when the world loses its hard edges, moments Mondrian loved to capture in his early paintings of trees. I find it comforting knowing that Ed is awake while most of us sleep. He's prepping the ground, weaving his verbal nets, etching cracks in the dark. I don't imagine this will change, since the night is one of Ed's crucial edge places, the spatiality of his thinking. Over this past weekend, I happened to read a beautiful essay in the New York Times by Terry Tempest Williams about Utah's Great Salt Lake. It made me think about Ed, his activism, and the ways that his works have urged us toward place. Williams wrote, quote, "Pick your place anywhere in the world, and Great Salt Lake is a mirror reflecting a flashing light on what is coming and what is already here. Our natural touchstones of joy will deliver us to heartbreak. Each of us will face the losses of the places that brought us to life." End quote. It's true. We know it. It's heartbreaking. Luckily, even without Ed here with us at Stony Brook in the way he has been for so long, his paintings and his books will continue to help us face our places, to see them as worthy of attention and exploration, and to help us know that they are our common responsibility and our common grounds. Thank you.
Wow, I don't know what to say. Eloquent. It moves me, as you can see. There's something about what Megan says about watercolor painting that I would want to emphasize, though, as what I'm drawn to. I mean, I've tried other media, acrylics, oil, but I find them plodding and tedious. And also, I'm well aware of the ancient tradition, that goes back so many centuries. Whereas watercolor is a relatively recently, not that recently, but nevertheless fairly recently explored medium. And there's something about the difference between doing a watercolor painting, which, as Megan says, I never spend more than maybe 20 minutes, or maybe 30 minutes on it. Rarely go back, rarely touch it up, very rarely. And that contrasting with writing books, these being the two epicenters of my creative life, is very instructive. And so watercolor painting for me means that you can really say something, you can produce an image of something with your hand motion very, very quickly. That's exactly what you can't do when you're writing a book, because you're writing, you're rewriting, you're overwriting, you're underwriting, it's writing all over the place, right? It goes on for years. So to me, there's something very, not just refreshing, but the difference of medium is so very striking. And yet, in both cases, of course, they share the sense of getting it right. And the difference is between, verbal formulations, which require a certain amount of luck. You just have to hang in there and keep rewriting and writing until you get a phrase that really, really sounds right to your own inner ear. With watercolor painting, I don't know, I find it kind of mysterious. Doesn't always work, of course. 7 out of 9 paintings are failures. But the fact that even once in a while, an image will spring forth that really speaks, to you and to others, I hope, is really mysterious. And I kind of like to keep it as a mystery, I have to say. I don't really understand it too well. Although Megan's helping me to begin to understand this better. I mean, I never really haven't thought about the way that the white paper, I never questioned that. I let the white paper, and in this case, this is just white canvas, you see. Have its own integrity. It's speaking through the color, through the form. So, what Megan describes as the elaborate work on grounding, I don't even think of, there's no grounding. There's just a watercolor box, a couple of brushes, the paper, and the simplicity of that is very, very, very seductive. It's incredibly captivating. Also, we start with, empty pages, and that's a white ground, right? Think about it. But still, the fact is that these are subject to so much revision and rethinking that it's really a different world. Her talk really helps me to see that these are almost polar opposites. I hadn't quite thought of it that way. I just thought, well, painting, I've always enjoyed it. I'm doing it, still doing it. But I hadn't thought of it in relationship to writing until I heard her remarks. And I do think that it's not that everyone should do it. It's not that it's healthy. I don't know. It's for me refreshing that this could be the case. And the other peculiar thing about the way that I do my paintings is I really need to start from a vista. From something, so to that extent, very oculocentric. So it has to be a striking view of some kind. I rarely photograph it because I'm not really interested in the detail. And whether the painting got it right or not, it does not interest me, you see, in the least. But that striking vista, and here we touch upon Anne's paper too, the horizon, above all, drawing me out into that vista is a very powerful, magnetic source. It really feels like I'm leaving myself and entering the landscape through the image itself. It's a very powerful move. I guess you could call it largely or loosely therapeutic. I hear relay or remark that I have a mentor in painting. Is a pretty well-known American abstract expressionist close to de Kooning, who was my teacher in Connecticut years. And I went into, well, I started much early in life, to become a painter. Gave it up, and then I came back to this in my 30s, but I came back to it because I had a very intense psychoanalysis with a person who since became very famous. I didn't even know that he was so well regarded, Hans Lowald in New Haven. And so, in the course of that analysis, he intimated, he never directly advised his patients. That's too direct and of course can encourage resistance. But he intimated that maybe I could supplement my writing, which I was, obsessed with at those years, my 20s and 30s, with something else. He didn't even name it. It could have been music, it could have been anything, right? I figured out, well, for me, it's painting. There's no question. It felt right. I started life that way. No reason why I couldn't return to it. And so I went into the studio of Dan Rice, this New York abstractionist painter, And I told him a little bit about my personal history, and then he made a remark that I will never forget. He said, "Ed, you must paint your unconscious. You don't paint objects, you don't really paint the landscape as such, but you paint something that has another life to it, another origin. I would now call this the wild, the wild within." Freud called it the unconscious. Well, I don't, that's one metapsychological way of regarding all this, but I think of it as, coming from a call from somewhere else, right? I know not where, and I need not locate it. Don't think I want to locate it. And I think I've been very lucky to rediscover this. It's a very, very, just 7 or 8 years old. I really wanted to be a painter. It was clear to me that this is where I was going. My parents were not happy with this. They thought this is very risky, that our son might become, as they called it, a bohemian. So they sent me to a private boys' school half a country away, Kansas to North Carolina, because that school had no art at all, completely excluded. Wow, it was, that was a very grave experience. But I'm very tenacious, I make the best of wherever I'm at, I guess. I try to, and so I really gave it up. I gave it up until I entered the studio of Dan Rice, you see, when I was 35 or 40 years old. It was a midlife moment, you can say. No question about that. I think I'm very lucky to have been able to explore these 2 avenues so different. And Megan's paper really helps to emphasize how different watercolor painting is even from traditional painting. And given the brevity, the quickness, the wit, you really have to put into it. You also have to be prepared to just junk, to most of what you do. I mean, it's just doesn't work. It has to either work right away or not at all. That itself is, absolutely unthinkable in philosophy. Because if something doesn't work, well, we rework it, we doggedly stay with the topic for many years until we think we get it right. But this is really something else. This is really living in the instant. The very, very powerful instant that really speaks in a way that I think writing, with the possible exception of poetry, of course, I think they see that as, in between prose and painting. I cannot do. So there was so much more I could explore here from what Megan says. I love the Leonard Cohen quote. There's a crack in everything through which you can see light. I have been struck by that before, that statement. In a certain way, that really released me into my work on edge, which is a kind of crack of its own sort. And my view that edges are not merely the ends of solids or limits of solids, as Socrates called them, but ways into whole life worlds and histories that would not otherwise be accessible, except conceptually in a very abstracted way. So edges lead us in that way into the surrounding world. So they're cracks in their own way. They're awkward moments in the structure of anything. And then through them, around them, we see things we would not have seen without that. If we were, somehow having a luminescent, spontaneous mind, like a deity's mind, well, it would not be exciting, and it would be all foreknown, or at least mostly anticipatable. But edges keep us in the dark a lot of the time. And so for me, painting brings us into the light in an extraordinary way that language really cannot really do. At least I can't make it do that. And so, much more to say, Megan, but thank you for your remarks. You understand me better than I understand myself.
Thank you. Now we will hear from Jennifer Carter, also from Stony Brook University.
Hello. It's fitting that this event be held adjacent to Recruitment Week, since I first met Ed during mine. When I got into Stony Brook, my then advisor, David Hoy at UC Santa Cruz, had been about as excited as I'd seen him, telling me that Stony Brook among Continental schools is just about the best. When it came time for Recruitment Week, David told me to talk to Ed, who had been David's advisor, not for David's PhD, but for his undergraduate thesis at Yale. I think I'm probably the only person here who was mentored by one of Ed's undergraduate students, Yale being his alma mater and his last post before Stony Brook. At recruitment, talk to Ed I did. I learned that he was not only an important philosopher, I didn't know quite how important at the time, but he genuinely cared about students, about Stony Brook, and about an endangered little field, continental philosophy. When I arrived here from California, it was mid-aughties. It was the second term of George W. Bush's presidency. I was in close contact with Ed during my first semesters, but I don't think I would have been bold enough to form a friendship with him had he not made a special point of asking after not only my well-being, but my brother's. David Carter, who was also a graduate student. Dave was in the first cohort in the Master's in Philosophy and the Arts program, an example of Ed's important accomplishments, and it is hard to exaggerate its importance in general, and to Ed personally. In the fall semesters, Ed would usually teach a seminar in the Master's program late Tuesday evening in Manhattan. He would take the train to Port Jefferson to stay over at philosophy professor Peter Manchester's house in Port Jefferson Station. Because I lived close by, and because I was friends with Peter, it was a regular occurrence that I would pick Ed up from the train and drive him there to Peter's. It was so regular, in fact, that Peter, who was an expert among many things of music, popular culture, ancient philosophy, and food, would buy a particular wine by the case to have on hand for these occasions, named after the California city, Cambria. Because this happened on Tuesdays, one of these evenings fell on November 4th, 2008, the evening Obama was elected. Ed, Peter, and I raised a glass. Several seminars later, Ed and I were at Peter's again in 2012 on the evening of Obama's re-election, and this time I brought with me my now husband, Randy, and our then 6-month-old daughter, Jenny. Randy was then in the master's program, and Ed was his advisor. At that time, it was very present to me that it was unusual for a female philosophy graduate student to have a baby while still on campus, though a few male graduate students had become fathers while in the offices. But Ed was always supportive. He not only thought it was good that I was having a baby, I was 31, but good philosophically to experience having children. This is something, having babies, which I would go on to do 3 more times, which I was also keenly aware, in addition to being a woman, was an unusual thing for a philosopher to do. But Ed got this. For him, it was always the case that philosophy and life intertwined. On these occasions of meeting up with Ed, which over the years took different forms, like going with him to Alyssa's department parties, He would carve out time to speak, to catch up with both me and with Randy, who was also working on a thesis. Ed has, as you know, a tremendous natural sense of reciprocity. What is especially striking about this, though, is that we were not the only ones. Ed has meetings and occasions planned throughout the day, always. Sometimes with a visiting guest, sometimes with a master's student whom he is helping apply to PhD programs, and he meets with his doctoral students, of which, as we know, it is an understatement to say he has several. This natural sense of reciprocity also goes for his considerable collection of friends and colleagues he's become close to over the years. He is extremely diligent about getting together with them, many of whom are also philosophers or psychologists, theologians. He makes heroic efforts to visit them, traveling, giving up time he undoubtedly needs for sleeping and solitude, leisure, that he devotes instead to them. Not because he has to, but rather he enjoys their company. I often hear of him going to jazz shows with Lorenzo Simpson, going to a show of Megan Craig's, and countless times meeting up with friends while traveling. Ed keeps in touch. As you may know, one of Ed's intellectual heroes is Freud, and like Freud, Ed genuinely loves people. And this love of people is part of his pedagogy, part of his work, part of his life. It's part of his nature. And he treats each one as an individual and an equal. What always impresses me is that when we happen to be at a big event together, whether SPEP, which as you know is the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy, which Ed helped found, or a talk here in the city, Ed always makes an effort to set aside some time to see me. If you know him, you know the sheer amount of people Ed makes time for in his life. And you know when he gets together with them, even if they are like me, colleagues, he is so rarely nearly working, even though he works very hard. It's not out of a sense of duty that he keeps in touch, even though he's committed to it as a duty. He genuinely and simply enjoys being together with his friends, discussing philosophy with them, experiencing art and music with them, and helping them. This speaks to Ed's unstructured but organized approach to work, but also time in general. Whatever it is, philosophy, writing, teaching, traveling, is going to get done, but as an outgrowth of what it naturally is. Curiosity, friendship, enjoyment, thinking, creating. Of course, there's also toil and heavy lifting, but that's never the point. And this is equally true for Ed's many projects, whether his art, his writing, his music, and especially a subject to which I'll now turn back for a moment, his teaching. As you're no doubt aware, Ed devotes a considerable amount of energy to it. One day he told me something I was intrigued and reassured to hear. He still gets nervous before each meeting of a seminar. In the years I've been here, Ed has never repeated a course in either the master's or the doctoral program. He's told me he cannot repeat a single lecture. He must, he says, reread and prepare fresh notes on each text, even ones he's taught several times. Despite how busy he is, and you know how busy, he's been president of the APA, chair of the department, not to mention writing his innumerable books, essays, lectures, painting, traveling. He also teaches new texts each semester. He is never done with the class, always revising, thinking through, never really resting. And despite his experience, his stature even, he makes room for other voices he thinks are important for his students to hear. When I was in his seminars, I heard from Fred Evans, who's going to speak next, Len Lawler, who spoke earlier, Michael Nass, Don Landis, Susan Bredlau, Carmen McKendrick. You may be sensing a theme here. These are all former students of his. He brought in people from far and wide too, for instance, Jacob Rogozinski, and before I got here, Jacques Derrida. This is one of Ed's amazing virtues, his capacity for trusting people. And this is especially true of students. For instance, there were always graduate students who helped copy edit his work, and we learned so much about thinking that way. When I arrived, it was the world at a glance, and soon after, the world on edge. This was a major part of Ed's pedagogy, knowing before we knew it ourselves when we were ready to take on a big task, like editing, contributing an article, applying for a job, teaching a class, or finishing a degree. In this spirit of trust, of adventure, of courage, and enjoyment that he imparts as a teacher, it's this spirit of trust, of adventure, of courage, and enjoyment that he imparts as a teacher, more than something like objective knowledge. We, Ed students, and I count us all as his students, learn how to be, not how to shape ourselves into a mold, but how to be ourselves by watching Ed be himself, which, as we know, he always reinvents. This is partly why it's fitting that Ed has recently been working on emotions. Ed shows us to be a philosopher is to be a certain kind of emotional being, to bring about an emotional experience that offers something transformative, that edges in, that sneaks into us and up on us and gives us life, that gives itself as life. To be a philosopher is, I learned from Ed, to be a kind of sensitive being who allows emotions in, lets them develop, and give birth to something independent and unexpected. Just this past week, Ed's talk offered a different perspective on emotions. What Ed observes is that while we might try to restrict emotions to mental or even more mere physiological occurrences, feeling can't be contained within the boundaries of the body or the self. It exists in the air around us, and it exists as the landscape, as the experience of the world, of place, and especially of natural phenomena that we experience as world. The world, Ed observes, is contiguous with being ourselves. We are world, and the world is us. Since I've known Ed, he's offered his perspective, his unique phenomenological point, that we can't lose the world, because to lose it is to lose ourselves. The structure of the world makes up our internal structure. The environment, and especially its living inhabitants, comprises not just an external reality, but makes its way into us. It makes us up. It is, as Tony mentioned, a kind of grace. This isn't a word Ed uses, but it is fitting. A kind of diaphanous interleaving of form and light that intertwines beings, that lets us be who we are together and gives us back to ourselves. This is the opposite of a solipsistic philosophy in which we give rise to the world from our thoughts alone. It's a philosophy of radical togetherness, but also radical otherness and difference. We change and evolve. Our world and our sharing of worlds is also changing, and we're different from before and from each other. Sometimes we might even be unrecognizable to one another, but even more especially to ourselves. While sitting next to Ed at the recruitment lunch last week, so many years after meeting Ed that first time, a second-year graduate student, Mahdi Malik, asked Ed what his advice would be to someone at the beginning of their career. Ed characteristically offered several connected but distinct thoughts, carefully and spontaneously working through what struck him at the time as most important to say. Among his advice was, don't be too settled in what you're going to do. He said, and I quote, follow the unlikely lead. That is, go ahead with something that seems obscure, that you may not even trust yourself to navigate. Take risks. Be weird. I'll leave you with another piece of advice as he put it to Mahdi. He said, be in a developmental phase. He says, I'm still in a developmental phase. And I believe him.
Beautiful talk. I don't know that I can respond adequately to it, but I can add a couple of remarks. The business about teaching new texts, that's it is a proclivity of mine. I don't know. There's some kind of deep fear of repetition. I don't really want to go over the same text and say even roughly the same thing. I want to say either something very different or just choose a different text, period. I mean, some of that I think is due to what Jen mentions. You know, I get very nervous before class because I am very deferential regarding whether I have anything to say at all. This actually, unfortunately, gets worse with age, at least for me. So, because I fear that, then I think I deliberately choose things I don't quite understand, haven't mastered, intriguing, I've heard about them, but and are relevant to our topic, but still, which I really have in no way mastered ever. And so, and I don't try to master them in class either. I mean, I really regard teaching as a kind of partial immersion and not attempting to give a definitive reading of any given text or theory, but really, you know, being, well, in a word from John Dewey, experimental. So teaching is experimental in that sense. Although I do teach text, and I don't really have other techniques of getting people to talk in class and so forth. I don't have a good pedagogical sense, I admit. So we are with a text, but the text is always new, and you know, I think I try to say some things I you know, surprise myself saying, given the contingency of the class and the urgency of, you know, saying something right here and now. I find that very challenging, and I will miss that, even as I suffer from it for a lifetime. I've been teaching since I was 21. I started really early, and got a special fellowship that encouraged people to leave. I was headed toward law school or medical school, and this is meant to lure seniors from these professions into teaching. So they immediately threw us in a classroom, no preparation, you know, really, it was kind of amazing that I ever survived this. And that was really trial by fire. It was, you know, extraordinary. But it drew me in, it intrigued me, precisely because I didn't think I was suited for it. You know, I mean, I didn't pick up any particular spontaneity or, you know, proclivity or talent. I just thought, okay, this is worth working on. I can do it better next time. Mm-hmm. So I stayed with it. And so the experiment worked. The Carnegie Foundation had a number of these fellowships across the country, meant to lure people away from the lucrative professions, you know, in teaching. No longer do they exist, but it was kind of a remarkable experiment, I must say. And I really appreciate Jen's bringing up this recent work of mine on emotion, which doesn't quite fit into the series of other work I've done, although it's been something that has intrigued me for many years. I used to teach an undergrad course here, actually, often in this very room. Kind of experimental, you know, studies of emotion. Partly did come from my immersion in psychoanalysis. But then, you know, I just was very curious, you know, what is emotion? It seemed very fugitive, you know, very elusive, and it still does. But I just decided to, you know, life was going on. I was not getting younger, and I just thought, okay, I'll just make a statement about emotion, which is a rather extreme statement, as it turns out. You know, that emotion is around us, not in us. And then, as Jen very nicely described it, something we as much encounter, pick up from around us, from others and from atmospheres, moods and so on, as anything that we bring forth ourselves on the model of self-expression, which I'm very critical of. Because I think that's just the wrong path. It doesn't really get us very far if we go down that path. So I was really interested in turning emotion into literally a phenomenon. It's something we actually encounter. We actually can describe it, bring it into our lives and so on, but it doesn't Yes, there are subjective determinants. I know that neurological coordinates, of course, all that's true, but it doesn't really capture what's special about emotion, which that it comes to us as much as from us. That was my last published book, a short book, but it was really attempting to, pursue this rather radical thesis that I became very intrigued by, and I kept finding then confirmation here and there. Cynthia Willett at Emory has some wonderful things on this interspecies emotion. So how species communicate through shared affect, and that affect is out in the space between the species who are confronting each other or communicating somehow, and that to me was absolutely fascinating, and again was part of an effort to de-subjectify the emotional life, and that's really part of my trajectory in much of my writing, is indeed to de-subjectify and to bring things into phenomenal and periphenomenal, presence, because I think that's the way life is. I just want to give a special kudo to Jennifer. She's amazing. Now has a flourishing large family, writing wonderful original work on touch that I have been deeply moved by. She won the Best Dissertation of Entire University Prize a few years ago for her work there. And she collaborates closely with the Rigori, and the two of them have co-authored things, and they're very closely collaborative. This is a wonderful way by which a graduate student or a previous graduate student, she's now a faculty member with us, have reached out and actually collaborated with a well-known person and not cowed by them, but ready to talk to them on their own terms. And Jennifer is fearless in this regard and brave, and she does this with a Rigori who's known to be a highly opinionated person, and so all the more admirable. Well, I could continue, but these are just a few responses to a beautiful talk that I had not heard before. Most of these, of course, I haven't. So these are all spontaneous comments of mine. So,
We'll now hear from Fred Evans, Professor Emeritus with Duquesne University.
Thanks. Ed mentioned earlier that we were doing some work in common, so I chose to raise a question that's pertinent to that work, both for Ed and for me. And I think it probably fits with the work that a lot of other people are doing. So the name of the paper, the title is Beyond the Edge World, Speculative Cosmology and the Limits of Phenomenology. As my title suggests, I will focus on one of Ed's more recent books, The World on Edge. That text might seem to be a supplement to his highly influential books on the idea of place. In those books, he argues that place, quote, cannot be encompassed by anything other than itself, is at once the limit and the condition of all that exists, unquote. This priority of place includes its dominance over space and time, mind and body, and stipulates that the very being of a sentient body just is to be place-bound. Moreover, it emphasizes that his claim for the priority of place is based on descriptive and phenomenological considerations rather than logical or metaphysical ones. His impressive lucidity and poignancy as a writer suits his choice of phenomenology. It allows him to capture the salient characteristics of the wide range of phenomena that he presents to us in striking detail. This accomplishment is abetted further by the supporting materials but he draws from a myriad of other fields, thinkers, and worldly events. Despite Ed's allegiance to the idea of place, he recalibrates its status by subsequently granting priority to his new and creative idea of edges. I'm very enthusiastic about this transition, but want to raise a question concerning a limit that Ed seems to set for his edge world. My presentation of this issue is divided into 3 sections. The first reminds us of the meaning Ed gives to edges, as well as to phenomenology with which he approaches them. The second section examines the primacy he assigns to edges, and the third asks the question about Ed's phenomenological description of the edge world. Would he be able to include it in a speculative edge? I'm sorry, start that over again. Would he be able to include in it a speculative edge, one that moves us beyond a purely phenomenological and anthropocentric description of the cosmos, of that endless and heterogeneous infinity that engulfs us and everything else? I say this is a question for Ed, but it's also a question for me. So first, edges and periphenomenology. We usually think of edges as the limits that passively mark the borders of things, places, and events. In contrast, Ed says that, quote, every edge and every perception of an edge is on the way to elsewhere, on the verge of going beyond, on the verge of going somewhere else, unquote. An edge is therefore like a porous boundary rather than a closed border. Despite this contrast, Ed also holds that the two terms, limits and edges, are internally related to one another. He borrows a term from Deleuze, reciprocal presupposition, to clarify the effective presence that limits and edges have for one another. Quote, no edges without a limit that superintends them, no limit without edges that complicate it and populate its otherwise empty ideal space, unquote. Ed adds that edges bring with them a characteristic anxiety of the uncertain and the precarious. We therefore tend to overlook edges and instead put our trust in, quote, the reassurance of the central mass of things and the familiar core of places and events, unquote. It also contends that edges possess a material intentionality. Ed was talking about nervousness a little bit earlier. Well, it also is sometimes grabs hold of me too. Sorry. It also contends that edges possess a material intentionality of their own, one that unmindedly intends what is beyond them. Whatever our role in constituting the existence of these edges, it is they that carry us forward toward the next transition. It invents the term periphenomenology in order to pursue these edges. The prefix peri signifies that the periphery is the source of the center. For example, that edge is the source of the core of a place and not the other way around. This form of phenomenological description requires an attentiveness to edges of all sorts, to what a glance would be more likely to detect than perceptions guided by routine. Indeed, Ed sees paraphenomenology as defiantly opposing Husserlian essences are demands for descriptive exactness in all cases. We must allow the phenomena to dictate the type of descriptions that are most suitable to them. In other words, Ed follows the path of Merleau-Ponty, Dewey, James, and other phenomenologists who hold that ambiguous or vague presences are, quote, positive phenomena, realities in their own right, and not the products of inaccurate perceptions. The phenomena upon which Ed concentrates can therefore, quote, be brought into words that are neither too precise nor too vague, but that are true to the edges themselves, unquote. Despite his affinity with more radical phenomenologists like Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and Heidegger, Ed does not share their preoccupation with pre-reflective experience or the dizzying heights of being. There we go. Quote, his concern is with, quote, any kind of level of experience, implicit or explicit, in which edges are operative, including those that belong to transhuman realms, as in wilderness or the sky, unquote. Ontological priority, the next section is ontological priority. At places in the world on edge, Ed emphasizes that he avoids committing to an ontology that would go beyond the compass of what he can phenomenologically describe. But in other places, he argues that edges, in their continual upsurge, reinsert themselves as primary. Ed more fully states the primary status of edges when he says, quote, the premise throughout this book has been that the edges of things and places and events and of much else besides, far from being secondary and external, are primary. They are the formative features of that of which they are the edges. Far from edges being only the final stage of something, they are also where that something begins, unquote. On this same theme, Ed returns us to the relation between limits and edges. Despite the intimate relation between the two that we noted earlier, Ed now adds that we, quote, navigate the world by way of actual edges, unquote, and that they therefore have priority over the posited or presumed and secondary presence of limits. It is, however, a priority for edges in the sense of being a first among equals in the playing field constituted by limits and edges. In other words, the priority of edges is immanent in the edge world rather than transcending it. Now, the next section is the cosmos and my question. Many of us who value phenomenology nonetheless want to go beyond its limits. This is especially true for those of us who find the work of Alfred North Whitehead, Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, David Bohm, and other cosmologists important for both ontology and political ethics. Ed is both favorable to such thinkers and quotes them frequently in his writings and lectures. But in The World on Edge, he cautions us that we cannot know what is on the other side of the horizon of the world. As we move forward, the horizon constantly recedes, revealing new phenomena in its wake. But at the same time, it limits us to what we can experience within its domain. Indeed, the horizon and its receding, like the distinction between foreground and background, exist only for sentient beings and their sensory manner of experiencing the world. The receding horizon and the foreground and background distinction, like its edges, are therefore real as constituents of the compound relationship between subjects and their surroundings, real as part of the plenum of edges that guide our movement within the world. But they would not exist in a world without sentient beings. The relation between cosmos and the edge world can be stated in another way. In phenomenology, the intertwining between ourselves and the world is often abbreviated as the in itself for us, the in itself for us. We might therefore say that cosmologists would like to capture the idea of the in itself for us as a reality within the cosmos in itself for itself, the cosmos in itself for itself. We can make this formulation of the cosmos more concrete by a glance at how Whitehead and Deleuze and Guattari might instantiate it. In his Process and Reality, Whitehead begins by stipulating the necessity and value of speculative philosophy, that is, a schema of ideas for interpreting experience, guiding the imagination, and constructing itself further on the basis of criticisms from philosophy, art, science, and many other quarters. Using what he knows phenomenologically about his own sentient existence, Whitehead views the cosmos as consisting of societies composed of interacting actual entities. These actual entities have varying degrees of sentience depending on the complexity of the given society. The solidarity of the cosmos is ensured because the concrescence or becoming of each actual entity involves its creatively prehending all the other already existing things in the universe. In short, we have a cosmos characterized by three interrelated forces: solidarity as the intertwinement of the actual entities, heterogeneity as the difference among singular actual entities, and an endless creative or fecund process of producing novel actual entities and societies from the prehensive interplay among the others. Whitehead's cosmology is compatible with Ed's edge world because each actual entity is sentient to one degree or another. But it is speculative in that it does not use phenomenological grounding for its postulation that the cosmos, its geological formations as well as its flora and fauna, consist of sentient entities. We could also say that Deleuze and Guattari, we also could say that Deleuze's and Guattari's cosmos as chaosmos, with its interacting and intertwined multiplicities or assemblages, and its forces of deterritorialization and reterritorialization, display the primordial and processual characteristics of solidarity, heterogeneity, and fecundity. These aspects are meant to hold for the entirety of the cosmos, but the authors of Thousand Plateaus do not go as far as Whitehead. They do not attribute sentience to sandstone and the other multiplicities of the physical-chemical stratum of the universe. On the other hand, Deleuze and Guattari also allude to some phenomenological descriptions, even using Whitehead's term prehension for the sort of perception that takes place during the deterritorializations of assemblages or the organic and human strata of the cosmos. Nonetheless, Deleuze and Guattari do not use phenomenology as grounds for their claim that the cosmos is chaosmos. Their cosmology, like Whitehead's, may therefore be thought of as speculative. At this point, it is clear that Ed shares the same spirit as the three other thinkers, the spirit of a processual reality. He probably would also endorse solidarity, heterogeneity, and fecundity as characteristics of the edge world. These thinkers also share some of the same ethical aims. For example, Ed has noted that a more exact periphenomenology of edges could prepare us to, quote, to deal more adroitly with climate change, nuclear destruction, neoliberalism, and the other disasters in which we, along with the Earth itself, are now caught up, unquote. This aim would also hold for the type of cosmologies I have been summarizing. More generally, these cosmologies and edge world could help us adopt an attitude of cooperating with the denizens of the globe or cosmos, instead of continuing with the ideology of mastering them or taking ourselves to be their shepherds. The cooperative approach would involve hearing, to the degree possible, the voices and languages of those myriad inhabitants. It would also imply attributing ethical standing to them rather than viewing them merely as means to our ends. In short, it would help us to escape our anthropocentrism to a fuller degree than currently present. Although Ed and the cosmologists share the same spirit and ethical goals, it's still not clear to me if Ed would accept the cosmologist speculative edge as an acceptable part of the edge world. To begin with, Ed says that, quote, if our perceptual powers are not able to locate the edge of the physical universe with any specificity, we must take recourse to thinking, whether as metaphysical or theological or as scientific theory, to deal with shortcomings at the level of sensory awareness, unquote. But on the next page, Ed cites Kant and argues that thought without sensory content is empty and leaves us with speculations that are, quote, futile when it comes to discussing the outer edges of all that is, unquote. Well, they just don't come to, there we go. To, however, subsequently introduce a new type of edge that may seem closer to affirming speculative edges. He calls these ulterior edges and says that they fall outside the range of ordinary ones. More specifically, they indirectly, quote, signified beyond their own physical mass and configured surface and are indefinitely expansive, unquote. For example, Ed speaks of the sublime and the egregious that appeared in the Atacama Desert in Chile during the fascist regime of Augusto Pinochet. On the one hand, special telescopes installed in the desert produce images of cosmic events. On the other, bone fragments in the sand indicated the fate of those who were disappeared by Pinochet's heinous military. The indirect edges of this sort, images and bone fragments, are thus ulterior edges and captured by Ed's recourse to what he calls reflective thinking. But it's still not clear if Ed thinks that these edges are speculative ones that might suit the cosmologists we have named. For Ed points out that Deleuze has to resort to the idea of a shock that brings about a sudden leap in order to evade the stultifying sea of false sincerity, and therefore can presumably capture new truths about the cosmos and its innocence. It is speaking of Deleuze's idea of encounter here, but it also holds for Deleuze and Guattari's joint notion of absolute deterritorialization in Thousand Plateaus. In contrast to these leaps, Ed's idea of reflecting thinking advocates that we must, quote, think through what it means to think on the edge of disaster and to stay on the edge, perched there uneasily, indefinitely suspended and without any prospect of egress from that edge, unquote. But thus to stay on that edge still remain within the receding horizon of the phenomenologically accessible edge world. Can a world on edge include a speculative edge that carries us over from the edge world into the cosmos as an in itself, for itself? That is, an infinite expanse embodying the three ontological characteristics of solidarity, heterogeneity, and fecundity, and having the comprehensiveness of Whitehead's and Deleuze and Guattari's cosmological ideas. I know I'll get an answer to my question from Ed. Either it's already in the world on edge and I just missed it, or a response will be in a new book, one of those that Ed will be writing on the edge of his retirement. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, this is a vast topic, cosmology, and Fred is writing a book on cosmopolitanism is, very important new work on a new sense of the cosmos that I greatly respect, though it's his own work. I mean, it's really something I'm just learning from. My tendency is for better or worse, is really to go in the opposite direction, not from here on up to the, a speculative cosmological stratum. I don't deny it, but also don't see how actually we can pull that off in this respect. I'm a good Kantian, I think, in that regard. I'm skeptical about moving there as a metaphysical step. And so I would contrast what Fred is doing with my own main drive and proclivity at this stage, which is really to move back and down into the earth. I'm very struck by the fact that the late Husserl, really resolutely turns to what he calls Erdboda, the earth as a dwelling that we must acknowledge more adequately. So it's almost like we're going in two different directions. Fred's going up and out. I'm going down and in. Take your pick. You know, there's a lot to be said about both. He picks out something, I forgot I even coined this term, but it's rather intriguing to hear it come back at me. Ulterior edges. That was a risky, compromised term. Here, I'm closer to Derrida's notion that instead of positing a perfect democracy, a form of government that we should aim at and that we can expect to have realized as such, we should be skeptical. So here we have Derrida's notion of democracy to come. It seems to me as not just a very constructive way of thinking about democracy, but thinking about any form of ulterior edges. So this is like, you know, it can be posited, it can be valuable as posited, but for us to claim that it is realizable as such is where I would draw the line and be skeptical on this front. So I'm very intrigued at the way that Fred brings in Whitehead, who has been a long-term favorite of mine. I've never figured out a constructive way to incorporate him because he's so vast and so amazingly inventive in his process and reality. So I welcome him being brought in, but I'm humbled by him because Whitehead was of another order. But I would point out that his notion of prehension, I find very, very useful. Prehension is really another way of thinking about my notion of periphenomenology, that edges help us to prehend, not necessarily to apprehend, but to prehend. Again, a certain adumbration, a certain sense of what is coming or to come. To me, that's really, that's what the Edge world is really all about. It's moving us toward something which we cannot know as objective content, but nevertheless we must respect the signal and prehensively be willing to follow out that road. This connects closely with something I've been developing recently with the help of my friend, the poet George Quasha, which his term is eco-proprioception. So in eco-proprioception, I find myself aware of the larger environment in a non-thematic, non-objective way that must be respected. And George is saying that poetry, it operates this way. It adumbrates a larger world than it can ever name as such. I'm intrigued by this, and I think it's very helpful for environmental thought that we realize that we are in a kind of peripheral contact with the natural world, more so than we may be willing to admit or ever know explicitly. So in eco-proprioception, I'm as it were moving out from this pre-objective, pre-thematic awareness of a larger world, in this case a larger natural world, and then I would say the earth as the ultimate eco-proprioceptive arc of our collective human awareness of where we stand. So much more to be said on these fronts, and since Fred and I are going to be writing a book together and in this area, it remains to be articulated.
We will find an answer.
Down the road, right. But thank you, Fred. Right.
Now, before we hear from Stony Brook Professor Emerita Kittay, Ann O'Byrne has a few words.
Eva, Ed joined the department, if I'm not mistaken, in 1977. You joined the department in 1979. Look at that for a commitment to this place, this institution, Stony Brook University. I want to grab this opportunity to say a few things about Eva, if I may. I could start with awards, you know, Guggenheim's, NEH, APA, Phi Beta Kappa, SWIP, Woman Philosopher of the Year. I could give a list of books on topics like moral philosophy, on metaphor, on disability, love's labor, so well known, such a change maker in our field. And your latest book, Lessons from My Daughter. But I want to talk a bit about what you mean to this department, what you mean as a mentor, what you mean to us here, if I may. What I think about when I think about Eva is the sentiment, oh, that's how it's done. So for all of us who are in philosophy here, as undergrads at some point, you came across this thing called philosophy, and you were trying to figure out what it was. There was something sexy, there was something kind of cool about these people. How do I do that? And had I known you at the time, Eva, I would have been able to look at you and think, that's how it's done. And as time went on, I didn't get to meet you until I joined the department here. But I came across your work, and when I began to think about philosophy, and what was really cool about it was finding out how to philosophize about something. And then I think of your work and I think, that's how it's done. You want to philosophize about something, that matters. Again, you look at your philosophy, that's how it's done. And then I get to meet you and I get to be your colleague. And I get to see you in situations where you are doing philosophy in the way that makes sense to you, in the way that's moving the discipline in whole new directions. But you bump into people who are not as evolved as you are. I remember there was one session that was held in the Stony Brook Manhattan campus. I don't remember all of the people who were lined up at the desk the way you were, but I believe Peter Singer was among them. And Peter was not getting it. Peter was operating according to a scheme of things. He was committed to a system. He was committed to an ethics that, you know, he continued to grind the handle and produce results. And he was not getting what it means to do ethics like you do. And you were relentless. You pushed back every step of the way. And I found myself sitting in that room, Ed, I think you were there too. Yeah. I found myself thinking, that's how it's done. And on other occasions, when here we are as colleagues, and you know, as happens with groups of colleagues, there are moments when maybe everybody is not their best selves, and we're all acting out of childhood hurts, and it's all just going not so well. And then somebody who has a presence, who has a sort of moral authority, can speak in these situations, as I've seen you speak, with wisdom and with great respect for everybody concerned. And again, I found myself thinking, my goodness, this is how it's done. How Eva does it is how it's done. And then you just make the big decision about retirement. Oh, we missed you so much. But also to think at that moment of the thinking, the hard thinking about important things that you've been doing throughout decades, and that you keep doing it. You don't stop doing it. You brought out that beautiful book, Lessons from My Daughter. And then I think about also the ways in which you were a center of gravity for us, for women in the department over the years. And I think specifically of occasions when you would gather us all up and we'd split up into various cars and we'd drive up to your beautiful house at White Lake. And the highlight of those visits was the occasion when you took us to meet Sasha. There was a way in which the question of how one takes various parts of one's life, all of those things that matter, and bring them together. And when I saw you with Sasha, I felt most deeply of all, this is how it's done. We appreciate you enormously, Eva, and thank you.
You mentioned to me, Eva mentioned on the phone, she willingly, very quickly said, sure, I'm going to come for this celebration for Ed, and with no other thought. And she mentioned, I haven't been back to Stony Brook since the time, I think it's when you retired. And well, this is long overdue, and we should have another occasion like this, but we just wanted to present you with some so maybe we'll just set them up right back here for you, in case you don't know if you want to lay them down, but I'll put them right here for the moment. And let's go. Okay, yeah, great.
I'm extraordinarily moved. Thank you, Anne. Common ground. This is something that Ed and I have in common. That we do philosophy about things that really matter to us. I know when I was working on the issue of care and said, this is very relevant to me as well, and we talked a lot about that. I have enormous gratitude to you, to the department, and very especially to Ed for my career. I've spent my entire career here, and it's strange to be back. That commute is the thing that keeps me away. And it's amazing to see so many faces. We've all aged a bit. But Stony Brook's been a very central place for me. And mostly it's allowed me to do, and this is also so much your influence, Ed, it's allowed me to do the kind of work I want to do. I couldn't, there aren't that many departments in which I could have just written the kind of things I did. And speaking of being on the periphery, and I like Ed, always took issues that other people hadn't talked about very much, and that weren't central perhaps to the field, but that I thought were really important. And I wrote about cognitive disability in philosophy. Now, why would anyone think that's philosophy? But this department didn't bat an eyelash, and that's been really a real gift to me. Thank you. Thank you. And the first thing I wanted to say was people spoke about all the ways in which they were the generosity of Ed. And I've seen it, you can see it in this extraordinary list. I don't know how many people actually have a list like that of people they've been dissertation advisors to, and been on their committees, and spent hours and hours and hours of talking philosophy. But Ed's also been extremely generous to me, and I have been very grateful. I mean, I owe my job to you. You've written me letters, you've supported me in all sorts of ways, and really, I wouldn't have had the career I had if it hadn't been for you. So I really have enormous gratitude that I have to express to you as well as to the department. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you so much. I did not expect that, and I have been basking in the glory of Ed and his work and his humanity and his philosophical world. It's been really a fabulous time sitting here and absorbing all of this. I hadn't thought too much about the topic of common ground, but I realized, of course, the bit I'm going to read, which is from a piece I wrote in your Festschrift. It is part of the common ground because it's my appropriation of your work. You know, it's to the kinds of issues that I've been concerned about. And at the time I wrote this, I was working on the question of migrant care workers and what was the moral harm for these women who leave their homes, their young children, or their elderly parents. They come here to do what? To take care of other people's children or elderly parents. And it just, there's clearly an injustice, a set of injustices, global injustices that are at the bottom of that kind of global heart transplant, as Arlie Hochschild called it, global heart transplant. But I was also interested just in what is the moral harm? How exactly do you think about it? Because these women actually are making money for their children, you know, and they see what they're doing as care for their children. And yet, we know there's something really wrong here. And I was able to think about this using Ed's conception of place. And I turned it a bit to think of, you know, what if we think of the place that we are occupying, not as so much the place our body is in, but the body of the person we're caring for. So the paper is called the Place of Care. If you are interested, I just did those handouts so you could just follow the 5 different kinds of notions of place that I'm working with. So here I'm reading an excerpt, an abbreviated excerpt. Casey writes, our life are so place-oriented and place-saturated that we cannot begin to comprehend what sheer placelessness would look like. Places are what we occupy as individuals. Places are part of the social world. The migrant care workers experience what Casey speaks of as the emotional symptoms of placelessness, disorientation, depression, desolation, a sense of unbearable emptiness. They say, sometimes you feel the separation and you start to cry. Some days I just start to cry while I'm sweeping the floor because I'm thinking about my children in the Philippines. The dislocations are not merely spatial. They are not only displacements of one's body, but also of the body of care. That is, the bodies of the ones they care for about and care for. How place-dependent is care? The labor of care requires an attentiveness to another that is best achieved by direct visual, auditory, and even tactile contact. Furthermore, caring is often facilitated when we have come to know the other well and are motivated by strong affective bonds. Such closeness is achieved only with difficulty when we do not inhabit the same place. Casey suggests 5 ways in which the body itself, that is our own body, is a place, a here. Now let us see how each of these are manifested when the body of the cared for is the caregiver's here. In doing so, we unveil the wrong done, at least some of it, done to the place-making agency of migrant caregivers, such as the person I mentioned on the sheet. First one is here in part. Here in part is the familiar notion of viewing our bodies as a form of extension that we differentiate into parts, different heres. We say, for example, the pain is here, not here. Similarly, we can, and we do, think of the body of a beloved for whom we care as one more part among the many parts of our own body. When we tend to the cut on a finger's child, we feel their anxiety, wince as we apply the astringent, feel the relief when the bandage is applied and the child smiles. That body remains a here for me as long as I have the attitude of care for it, and as long as I feel responsible for that individual's care. The migrant leaves this sort of here with her dependents. Here of my body proper. As we locate ourselves in a place, say in a room, it is as a body that we do so. A migrant mother whose here is the body of her children, ones who live in a place that she leaves her here in the sense of the here of her body proper, as well as in the sense of the here in part. But her loved ones at home, nonetheless, are here for her. She phones, are a here for her. She phones, she worries, she sees herself working for their care. At the same time, she is in a new here, New York, London, Singapore, taking care of other dependent beings for whom she also needs to be here when they need to. She struggles with this dual emplacement. She is thus not so much displaced as biplaced. One study is aptly entitled, I am here, but I am there, and says the migrant woman, socially defined as primary caregivers, have to distinguish their transnational motherhood from an act of abandonment or disowning their own children. Here of my body, the here of my body. This is the experience of the body as place in movement. I go from my house to the grocery store. I am here along the entirety of the path. When the body of the one for whom we care, experienced thus, our here is similarly the moving here of the other. My child goes to school and I accompany her, and the here of my body and the here of her body coincide. As she is in school, takes on another responsibility. Being at school is her here and no longer my here. When I feel confident about her care, I can let go of that here. The migrant woman has to relinquish this sort of here of her loved ones. Their comings and goings cannot be her own here. She has to trust that they will be in good hands as they move around their world. Her immediate concern must be the by-body of her charge. But the inability to follow her own child's movement through the world means the child she leaves becomes frozen in her memory. It is hard to envision her child as she goes to school, enjoys her friends, feels sadness, disappointment in her endeavors, and so on. The migrant woman with an elderly parent cannot accompany her mother or father to the doctor's office and comfort her in a hospital bed. This separation of the body of the loved one is a form of alienation. Indeed, it's a self-alienation that comes with the migrant experience. Both a bitterness and a comfort is found in the fact that the caregiving situation into which she is thrust, and that provides both for her livelihood and those back home, does make the by-body of another, her place as well. But it is not fully her place. It is temporary. She will be dismissed when her child gets older, when the ill person gets well, when the elderly person dies. Her relationships to those whose well-being are her long-term commitment comes unraveled through distance and time, and has somehow to be mended if she and they are to feel whole. Regional care, regional here. The regional here is the expanse constituted by the various paths we can pursue as a body. We are here in this house or in this neighborhood. Within such a region, we experience a here that has a direct relationship with here that is our body. When the body that constitutes the regional here is not our own, but that of another, the regional here occupies an ambiguous relationship to our own bodily here. In the case of the migrant woman, the here of the one they care about is the one they shared at one point and no longer share. I am a Filipina, she might say, and meant by that Philippines remains her regional here. Yet the regional here of the charge that she cares for now, and where she objectively finds herself, is of necessity a here for her. In terms of the regional here, she is again by-placed. Interpersonal, the interpersonal here. Finally, Casey, drawing on Husserl, speaks of an interpersonal as the other, as the others here resisting our own here, as an intrinsic limit to my own range. In contrast to this impersonal here, the caregiver sees the body of the other as the here where I locate my attention, identify my concern, direct my activity. To the extent that she can, the caregiver steps out of herself and finds her own sense of place in the other. The two interpersonal heres are polar opposites. In the Husserlian conception, the other defines where my here ends. In mine, the other is the place I enact an empathetic identification and her here becomes my own. And yet there is a third interpersonal. Casey speaks of an arc that bridges the here I experience of another. This is the place that is constructed intersubjectively. Such a place is constructed not only between people who live in a place, but also between people who live in different places. Relationships of care include all three forms of the interpersonal here as moments in the relationship. The body of the other is our own here when we attend to it and engage empathetically. But the body of the other also resists us. The other's needs, wants, desires are ultimately her own, and some will remain opaque and inaccessible to us. Our own needs, wants, desires will eventually assert themselves against the other. In addition, a caring relationship, like any relationship, needs to recognize both our discrete being and our connectedness. If I fully identify with the pain that renders you incapacitated, I too would become incapacitated and so unable to help you. If I care for you and about you without recognizing our differences, I will confuse my own state for yours and so be unable to meet your needs. If I so fully identify with you that I lose my moral compass, I will be incapable of giving you guidance in living a flourishing life. And if you see me as nothing more than an appendage of you, you will lose the respect for me that is critical to my ability to flourish not only as an individual, but also as an effective caregiver. Thus, while the body of the one we care for is the here for us, it can only remain so if we allow both of us to be the here of a relationship. Nonetheless, without a shared physical space, the place that a relationship the place that is the relationship, that arc, can become thin and precarious. This is the hazard faced by the migrants. The case of the migrant caregiver offers up a skewed geography of love and care. Given the relational constitution of self and the motivational structure of care, the care expected of a hired caregiver occupies a phantom space in this geography of relationships. The difficulty of recovering relationships is great not only because the ones left behind have changed, but also because the migrant woman who is by-placed undergoes a self-rupturing. With her fractured self, there is no longer an integral self to stand in relation with either of the parties for whom she cares. Without these relationships, her displacement is complete, and we can indeed expect to find the symptoms of placelessness that Casey so well described. The harm of severed relationships is joined with the harm of never feeling oneself as fully here.
Powerful paper by Eva, and we had talked about these matters years ago, right? I guess goes
Yes.
way back, and she really did a beautiful job taking, terms. My vocabulary was rather abstract, but she really concretizes it and puts it into action in an extraordinary way. It joins something I was going to talk about. I was going to make a kind of final statement, but for one thing, I left it in my hotel room. For another, it's getting pretty late, so it's okay. But one of the things I did want to talk about is what I hope to do next. and it does involve migrants, and particularly, as well as the incarcerated, and very closely related to Eva's work here, because it does have to do with deep displacement. So what is called re-entry from prison or from a detention center really is all about having to move into a place where you don't know your way around, so you don't even know the place. It's just what Whitehead calls a site. That's just a location, you know. Striking cases of this occur at the Elizabeth Detention Center, where, and some of you along with me have been active, where, you know, people released from detention are literally dumped on the street. Nowhere to go, no funds, no plans. It's literally no place at all. I mean, it's incredible placelessness that is part of this process of re-entry. And then friends of people who are in such situations, and some of you have done good work in this direction, the main task is to find, you know, a viable place for them in American society. This is not easy. This is, in fact, incredible struggle that can take years. But I'm very struck that Eva concentrating upon care workers and my own interest in the re-entry moment from prison or detention centers really has to do about finding place. And this is not just adequate place. It's not just a place of sustenance or support, but, you know, a place that actually involves some, at least minimal recognition, some emotional support of one form or another. And relationships, yes. It's not a matter, you know, you can't expect of people in such extraordinary circumstances to feel, quote, at home. I may never feel at home in the US. Nevertheless, they may be better off being here than were they to be deported back to their home country. So there's hope there, but the hope is really fragmentary in the sense it's not all clear. I mean, one person needs one kind of place and another person may need another. And so this becomes really very demanding work, and it's what I hope to do directly in retirement is to move more fully into this kind of work, because I just think it requires real dedication, and you know, any helping hand that can be offered is going to be valuable and make a difference. So in a strange way, although I started writing about a place from some, I don't know, some sense that it had simply been neglected in Western philosophy, I have come to realize that the place does actually have this concrete implication for issues of migration, the ethics of re-entry, and so on. And Eva's work has really helped me to see this much more clearly. And I really congratulate her on pursuing this in ways that have been very, very remarkable, effective, and eloquent, as you were today. And so let me congratulate Eva on really sketching out for us the dynamics, the here place, the by body, you know, these are all, they sound like rather abstract terms, but actually they're all about something very concrete, as she spells out in a number of writings that she has herself written. So, I mean, I think on that note of the relationship between place and offering helping hands to people in dire distress, the most recent group of which, of course, are the 50,000 migrants who've arrived from Texas and are being released from temporary shelters on Long Island and elsewhere, but nowhere to go. I mean, this is a crisis of the moment. Right.
I have an interesting footnote to that. Place where my daughter is being cared for. They are offering to house and train people to do caregiving work. As they, which of course is needed because there's a shortage of caregivers. But also this, and places them, right? Is a and gives them a way of entering into the society that they have now landed in.
Yeah, right. So, in that sense, place is just not a convenient, neglected philosophical concept, but it really affects all of our lives in a very specific and concrete way. And those of us who are fortunate enough not to have to find a new place altogether really must attune ourselves to this extraordinary need that, of course, is not only in America, but really around the world, considering massive migrations that we know from Syria and now from Ukraine, and soon, in fact, from many parts of Africa because of climate change. It's going to become even more massive. So my question is, what can we as individuals do to assist in this circumstance? And some of us can do one kind of thing, others another, but it's a critical time. And I think Eva's work here on caregiving is totally relevant to one of the major, if not the major, ethical and political task of our time. So Eva, thank you for that, and beautiful work. Right.
Thank you everyone. Thank you all for the last panelists too, and for all your contributions. We have a dinner set up. I mean, we can take a few minutes to mosey out, but at the very end of the hall, Salzburg Library, we should have the food set up. I don't have it checked in there, but I should be ready to go. So just make your way, stretch your legs, and then we're move the occasion over to Salzburg Library. Thank you, everyone.